The November wind cut across the plains like a cavalry saber, sending tumbleweeds skittering down the rutted main street of Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory. Jacob Thornton stood on the platform of the newly built railway station, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his dusty Stetson as the afternoon train from Cheyenne wheezed to a halt. Steam hissed from the locomotive's belly, mingling with the cold air to create ghostly wisps that danced between the wooden planks beneath his boots. He had not wanted to come. For 3 weeks, he had argued with his younger brother Thomas about this foolish arrangement, this desperate gamble that seemed to mock everything their family had built since coming west after the war. But Thomas had insisted, and now Jacob stood here, duty-bound to collect a woman he had never met, a bride ordered from a matrimonial agency back east, for a brother who could not be bothered to fetch her himself. If you're enjoying this story of the Old West, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support keeps these frontier tales alive. Jacob was 47 years old, a decade older than Thomas, and every one of those years showed in the lines etched deep around his gray eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair. He had seen more of life than most men twice his age, having served 4 brutal years with the Union cavalry before mustering out in '65 with nothing but his horse, his service revolver, and memories that still woke him in the dead of night. The Thornton brothers had claimed their homestead in the Wyoming high country in 1868, carving a cattle ranch from unforgiving land that had broken lesser men. While Thomas handled the business side, visiting buyers in Denver and Cheyenne, Jacob had spent 17 years in the saddle, building their herd from 20 head to nearly 3,000, earning respect from neighboring ranchers through hard work and fair dealing. He had never married, never courted, never allowed himself the luxury of softness in a land that demanded iron from its inhabitants. The train's doors opened with a metallic screech, and passengers began to disembark. Miners heading for the gold camps. In the Black Hills, a drummer with his cases of merchandise, 2 Chinese laborers, a circuit preacher clutching his Bible. Then she appeared. Catherine Adelaide Morrison descended the iron steps with a grace that seemed impossible given the 3 carpetbags she carried, her burgundy traveling dress somehow maintaining its dignity despite the journey from Boston. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair pinned beneath a practical bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water in spring. Her face held a quiet determination that Jacob recognized immediately, the look of someone who had made hard decisions and would not be easily swayed from her course. She surveyed the platform with an expression that was neither hopeful nor fearful, merely observant, taking measure of this rough frontier town that would become her home. Jacob stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture of respect his mother had drilled into him long before the war. "Miss Morrison, I'm Jacob Thornton." His voice carried the flat vowels of Ohio, though years in Wyoming had added a slower cadence to his speech. She met his gaze directly, and he noted with surprise that she did not flinch at his weathered appearance or the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "Mr. Thornton, I expected—" She paused, consulting a daguerreotype she pulled from her reticule. "I was told Thomas Thornton would be meeting me." Jacob felt heat rise beneath his collar, despite the November chill. "My brother sends his regrets. Business matters kept him in Cheyenne. I'm here to escort you to the ranch." It was a lie, though not entirely. Thomas was indeed in Cheyenne, but the business keeping him there involved a poker game at the Golden Eagle Saloon and the company of a dance hall girl named Ruby. Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line, and Jacob saw intelligence working behind those green eyes. I see. Well, Mr. Thornton, I've traveled 2,000 miles to honor a commitment. I suppose I can manage 20 more. She handed him 2 of her bags without ceremony, keeping the smallest for herself. As Jacob led her toward the buckboard wagon he had left at the hitching post, he found himself studying her from the corner of his eye. Most Eastern women who ventured west as mail-order brides wore their desperation like a second skin, fleeing poverty or scandal or spinsterhood with equal parts hope and terror. Catherine Morrison walked with her spine straight and her chin level, as though she were strolling through Boston Common, rather than the muddy street of a frontier town, where 3 saloons outnumbered the single church. The journey to the Thornton Ranch took nearly 3 hours, following a wagon trail that wound through sagebrush country before climbing into the foothills, where pine and aspen marked the transition to higher ground. Jacob drove the team of horses with practiced ease, grateful for the excuse not to make conversation. Catherine sat beside him on the wagon seat, her carpetbags secured in the bed behind them, studying the landscape with an attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite pretense. The afternoon sun painted the distant peaks in shades of purple and gold, and a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. When they passed the burned remains of a homestead, blackened timbers standing like broken teeth against the sky, Catherine finally broke the silence. Indian trouble? Jacob shook his head. Lightning strike last summer. Family moved back to Kansas after that. This country doesn't forgive carelessness. They rode in silence for another mile before Catherine spoke again, her voice carrying a note of determination that made Jacob glance sideways at her. Mr. Thornton, I should like to know what I'm walking into. Your brother's letters were optimistic about the ranch, the land, the prospects. But he said nothing of Indian raids, lightning strikes, or the evident hardships of frontier life. Jacob considered his words carefully, weighing honesty against the duty to support his brother's choices, however foolish they might be. The ranch is prosperous. 3,000 head of cattle, good water rights, a solid house and barn. We employ 6 hands year-round, more during roundup. Thomas wasn't lying about that. He paused, watching a pair of antelope bound across a distant ridge. This isn't Boston, Miss Morrison. Winters here can kill a man, caught unprepared. Nearest doctor is 2 days' ride. Nearest town with more than a saloon and a general store is Redemption Creek, and you've seen what that amounts to. Catherine absorbed this information without visible distress, her hands folded primly in her lap despite the wagon's jostling over the rutted trail. I did not come west expecting comfort, Mr. Thornton. I came seeking a purpose, a partnership, and perhaps a measure of independence I could never achieve in Massachusetts. There was a story behind those words, Jacob sensed. A history that had driven this educated, composed woman to answer an advertisement from a stranger 2,000 miles away. He had seen her luggage tags at the station, noting she had departed from Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, an address that spoke of breeding and refinement. Yet here she sat, accepting the reality of frontier life with more equanimity than most men showed when facing their first Wyoming winter. Thomas is a good man, Jacob heard himself say, though the words tasted like ash. Younger, maybe a bit impulsive, but he'll provide for you. The ranch came into view as they crested the final ridge, sprawling across a valley where Thornton Creek ran year-round, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. The main house was built of logs and rough-hewn planks, 2 stories with a wide porch that faced east to catch the morning sun. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, indicating that Rosa, Their Mexican cook and housekeeper had kept the fires burning. The barn stood 50 yards distant, its red paint fading but its structure sound, large enough to shelter 24 horses and store winter hay for the cattle that would come down from the high pastures when the snows deepened. Corrals held remuda horses, and Jacob could see two of the ranch hands, Charlie and young Pete, working to repair a section of fence. It was a good spread, built through years of back-breaking labor and careful management, a testament to what determination and sweat could accomplish in this harsh land. Catherine's expression softened slightly as she took in the ranch, and Jacob wondered what she saw. Did she notice the solid construction, the careful placement of buildings to withstand winter winds? Or did she see only the isolation, the vast empty miles between this valley and anything resembling civilization? "It's larger than I expected," she said quietly, and Jacob detected a note of approval in her voice that surprised him. "Thomas wrote that you had a small operation." Jacob felt a familiar irritation rise at his brother's casual dishonesty. "Thomas tends to undersell our success. Probably thought it would sound more romantic, building an empire together." He regretted the bitter edge to his words immediately. But Catherine only nodded, as though he had confirmed something she had already suspected. Men often confuse romance with deception, in my experience. Rosa emerged from the house as Jacob brought the wagon to a halt near the porch, wiping her hands on her apron and calling out a greeting in Spanish-accented English. She was a widow whose husband had worked for the Thorntons before pneumonia took him 5 winters past, and she had stayed on as part of the family, managing the household with fierce efficiency. "Señor Jacob, you bring the bride for Señor Thomas? But where is he?" Her dark eyes moved from Jacob to Catherine with open curiosity, taking in the woman's travel-stained dress and composed demeanor. Jacob climbed down from the wagon and offered Catherine his hand, which she accepted with natural grace despite the height of the seat. "Thomas is delayed in Cheyenne. Rosa, this is Miss Catherine Morrison. She'll need the guest room prepared." Rosa's expression flickered with something that might have been disapproval or concern, but she recovered quickly and swept forward to greet Catherine with genuine warmth. The interior of the house reflected the same practical solidity as its exterior. The main room served multiple purposes, with a long dining table that could seat 12, comfortable chairs arranged near the massive stone fireplace, and shelves lined with books that spoke of winter evenings when outdoor work became impossible. The wooden floors were worn smooth by years of boot traffic, and animal hides covered the walls, providing insulation against the bitter cold that would come with December. Catherine's gaze lingered on the books, and Jacob saw recognition in her eyes as she identified volumes of Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau. "Yours or your brother's?" she asked, gesturing to the library. Jacob felt heat rise in his face. "Mine. Thomas prefers the Denver newspapers and dime novels." It was an admission he rarely made, this evidence of a life before the war, when he had harbored dreams of teaching, of scholarship, before Shiloh and Antietam had carved such aspirations from his soul. Rosa showed Catherine upstairs to the guest room, a small but clean space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the creek. Jacob remained below, poking unnecessarily at the fire and wondering why his brother's absence bothered him more now than it had that morning. Thomas had always been the charming one, quick with words and easy smiles, able to talk his way into or out of most situations. After the war, when Jacob had returned home to Ohio, hollowed out and haunted, it had been Thomas who convinced him to come west, to leave behind the ghosts and build something new. They had been partners in this enterprise for 17 years, and Jacob had always told himself that his role was to work the ranch while Thomas handled the social aspects, the business dealings, the future. But watching Catherine Morrison carry her carpet bags up those stairs to wait for a man who could not be bothered to meet his own intended bride, Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of wrongness he could not quite name. That evening, Rosa prepared a welcome dinner of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie made from preserves she had put up in September. Catherine had changed from her traveling dress into a simpler gown of dark blue calico, and she had released her hair from its severe bun, allowing it to fall in soft waves around her shoulders. The transformation was subtle but striking, revealing a beauty that had been obscured by the rigors of travel. She sat across from Jacob at the long table, and they ate in relative silence, broken only by Rosa's attempts at conversation as she moved between the table and the kitchen. Jacob found himself studying Catherine's hands as she handled her fork and knife, noting the calluses on her fingers that spoke of work more demanding than embroidery or piano practice. "You've done manual labor," he observed, the words emerging before he could stop them. Catherine looked up, meeting his gaze with that same direct quality that had struck him at the train station. "I worked as a companion to an elderly woman for 5 years, Mr. Thornton. The position required nursing, household management, and a great deal of physical labor that most would not associate with genteel employment." She paused, taking a sip of the coffee Rosa had poured. Mrs. Hartwell was a difficult woman, demanding and often cruel, but she paid well and left me a small inheritance when she died. Enough to purchase a train ticket west and maintain my independence if... She did not finish the sentence, but Jacob understood. If the marriage to Thomas proved impossible, Catherine had the means to leave. It was a practical calculation, and he respected her for it. "Thomas arrives tomorrow evening," he said, though he had no confirmation of this. "The evening stage from Cheyenne gets in at 6. The lie settled between them like dust after a cattle drive, and Jacob saw from the slight tightening around Catherine's eyes that she recognized it for what it was. But she merely nodded and returned her attention to her meal, and he was grateful for her tact. After dinner, Catherine excused herself to write letters by lamplight in her room, and Jacob retreated to the porch, despite the cold, needing the vast darkness of the Wyoming night to settle his thoughts. The stars emerged in their millions, unmarred by city lights, stretching from horizon to horizon in a display that still moved him after all these years. He could hear cattle lowing in the distant pastures, the murmur of the creek over stones, the occasional bark of one of the dogs patrolling the perimeter. This land had claimed him completely, had given him purpose when he fought himself beyond redemption. And now his brother had brought a complication into their carefully ordered world. A woman whose quiet strength and unspoken sorrows called to something in Jacob he had long believed dead. Thomas Thornton arrived 3 days later, not on the evening stage, but in a rented buggy driven by a disreputable character from Redemption Creek who was owed money for gambling debts. He came without warning, without apology, rolling into the ranch yard at midday when Jacob was working with Charlie to break a new string of horses for the spring roundup. Thomas looked every inch the prosperous cattleman he pretended to be, dressed in a tailored suit from Denver, with a gold watch chain glinting across his vest and his boots polished to a mirror shine. At 37, he retained the boyish handsomeness that had always served him well with women. His fair hair and easy smile marking him as the favored son despite being younger. He leaped from the buggy with characteristic enthusiasm, calling out greetings to the ranch hands and searching the yard with his eyes for the bride he had ordered as casually as one might order a new saddle from a catalog. Catherine emerged from the house where she had been helping Rosa prepare preserves, her sleeves rolled to her elbows and a smudge of flour on her cheek. For a moment, the tableau held. Thomas frozen mid-stride, Catherine wiping her hands on her apron, Jacob still gripping the lead rope of the half-broken gelding he had been gentling. Then Thomas's smile broadened, and he swept his hat from his head in an exaggerated gesture of gallantry. "Miss Morrison, forgive my tardiness. Business in Cheyenne proved more complicated than anticipated." He crossed the yard in long strides, taking Catherine's flour-dusted hand and raising it toward his lips in a gesture that made Jacob's jaw tighten. Catherine's expression remained neutral, though Jacob thought he detected a flicker of assessment in her eyes as she took the measure of her intended husband. "Mr. Thornton, I'm pleased to finally meet you." The wedding was arranged for the following Sunday, giving Catherine barely a week to prepare and no time whatsoever to truly know the man she would pledge her life to. Reverend Samuel Blackwood rode out from Redemption Creek on Saturday evening, a circuit preacher who served 6 small congregations scattered across 3 counties. He was a thin man with the zealous eyes of a reformed sinner, and he spent the evening lecturing Thomas and Catherine about the sacred duties of matrimony, while Jacob sat silent in his chair by the fire, feeling an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with old war wounds. That night, unable to sleep, Jacob walked down to the creek and stood in the moonlight, listening to the water rush over stones and wondering why he felt like a man watching a hanging he was powerless to stop. Thomas spent the week courting Catherine with the same easy charm he brought to cattle negotiations and poker games, presenting her with wildflowers he had picked himself, regaling her with stories of ranch life that conveniently omitted the brutal labor and constant danger, promising her a future of prosperity and partnership that Jacob knew his brother had no intention of fulfilling. Thomas wanted a wife for the same reason he wanted fine clothes and a gold watch, because it signaled success, because it was what prosperous ranchers were expected to have. Catherine responded to his attentions with polite interest, but without the blushing enthusiasm Thomas was accustomed to inspiring in women. She asked practical questions about the ranch's finances, the education prospects for future children, the distance to medical care. Jacob watched these exchanges from a distance, mending tack or reviewing account books while his brother performed his elaborate courtship dance. On Thursday afternoon, Jacob found Catherine in the barn, examining the horses with a knowledgeable eye that surprised him. She ran her hands over a mare's legs with confident competence, checking for heat or swelling, then inspected the animal's teeth with the skill of someone raised around livestock. "You know horses," Jacob observed from the doorway, and Catherine startled slightly before regaining her composure. "My father bred them in Massachusetts before he lost everything to poor investments and drink. I spent my childhood in stables before we moved to Boston when I was 14. She straightened, brushing hay from her skirt. "These are fine animals, Mr. Thornton. You've built something impressive here." The compliments settled over Jacob like warm whiskey, and he found himself moving closer, drawn by an impulse he could not name. "Thomas had little to do with the breeding program. That's been my work." Catherine's eyes met his, and for a long moment they stood in the dimness of the barn, surrounded by the comfortable sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the sweet smell of hay and leather. "I've noticed," she said quietly, "that much of what makes this ranch successful seems to be your work, while your brother concerns himself with appearances and charm." It was a dangerous observation, one that threatened to crack open the resentment Jacob had been suppressing for 3 days. "Thomas has his strengths. He's good with people, makes connections we need for selling cattle." The words were automatic, the defense he had been offering for years whenever anyone questioned his brother's contributions. Catherine studied him with those penetrating green eyes, and Jacob had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen clearly for the first time in many years. "Loyalty is an admirable quality, Mr. Thornton, but it can also be a cage." Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting intricate patterns on the windows and the promise of snow heavy in the northwestern sky. Rosa had transformed the main room into something approximating a chapel, with wildflowers in mason jars and the good dishes set out for the wedding breakfast that would follow the ceremony. Neighboring ranchers began arriving at mid-morning. The Hendersons from the spread to the east, old Walter Pritchard, whose land bordered theirs to the south, the Mackenzie clan, who ran sheep despite the cattlemen's disdain, and a handful of others who constituted the scattered community of settlers trying to make lives in this harsh land. They came in wagons and on horseback, dressed in their Sunday best, eager for any excuse to break the monotony of frontier existence with celebration and gossip. Catherine descended the stairs at noon precisely, wearing a simple dress of cream-colored silk that she had somehow produced from her carefully packed carpet bags. She had arranged her auburn hair in an elegant knot, and she carried a small bouquet of dried lavender that Rosa had given her. She looked beautiful and terrified and utterly determined, and Jacob felt his heart break as she moved past him to take her place beside Thomas in front of Reverend Blackwood's makeshift pulpit. Thomas looked handsome and confident, grinning at his bride with the easy assurance of a man who had never doubted his right to possess whatever he desired. The assembled guests fell silent as Reverend Blackwood opened his worn Bible and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The Reverend's voice carried the practiced cadence of a man who had performed this ritual countless times, in churches and homes, and even once on a battlefield, where a dying soldier had wanted to marry his sweetheart before breathing his last. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Jacob stood to the side, serving as his brother's witness, and he found his gaze drawn not to Thomas, but to Catherine, whose face had gone pale beneath the rouge Rosa had helped her apply. When Reverend Blackwood asked if anyone present knew any reason why these two should not be wed, the silence stretched taut as fence wire, and Jacob felt words rising in his throat that he swallowed with desperate effort. But before Reverend Blackwood could continue, the door burst open with a force that made several guests cry out in alarm. A woman stood in the doorway, her blonde hair disheveled and her traveling cloak mud-spattered from hard riding. She was young, perhaps 25, with the painted features and revealing dress of a dance hall girl, and her eyes blazed with fury as they fixed on Thomas. "You bastard," she spat, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "You promised me marriage, Thomas Thornton. Promised me just 2 weeks ago in Cheyenne that you'd leave this godforsaken ranch and take me to San Francisco." She stumbled slightly as she moved into the room, and Jacob caught the scent of whiskey even from several feet away. "But instead, you're here marrying some mail-order Yankee while I'm left with nothing but your lies and your bastard growing in my belly." The room erupted in shocked exclamations and hurried whispers. Catherine's face had gone from pale to paper white, her eyes enormous in her stricken face as she stared at Thomas. Thomas himself had frozen, his charming smile sliding away to reveal something ugly beneath. The calculating look of a man weighing his options and finding them all bad. "Ruby, you're drunk," he said, attempting to recover his composure. "You don't know what you're saying. We had some fun together, that's all, nothing more." Ruby laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Fun? You moved into my rooms above the Golden Eagle for 3 weeks, Thomas. You promised me a future, promised me respectability. And now I find you're marrying another woman while I'm carrying your child?" She turned her furious gaze on Catherine. "Save yourself, lady. He's a liar and a coward who'll use you up and cast you aside like he's done with every woman who's been fool enough to believe his pretty words." Jacob moved before conscious thought could stop him, stepping between Ruby and his brother, with his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Miss Ruby, please, this isn't the way to handle this situation. Let's discuss this privately, away from all these people." But Ruby was beyond reasoning, her rage and hurt and desperation spilling out in front of the assembled guests like blood from a mortal wound. "There's nothing to discuss privately that shouldn't be said publicly. Your brother is a liar and a cheat, Jacob Thornton, and everyone in this valley should know it before this poor woman binds herself to him." She pointed a shaking finger at Thomas. "He told me his brother handled all the ranch work, that he was the brains and the charm, while you were just the hired labor. He said he deserved better than being stuck on this ranch, that he had ambitions beyond nursing cattle through harsh winters." The words landed like physical blows, and Jacob felt the careful edifice of loyalty and partnership he had built over 17 years begin to crack. He turned to look at his brother, seeing Thomas clearly for perhaps the first time, the weak chin behind the easy smile, the calculating eyes that weighed every interaction for personal advantage, the fundamental selfishness that had always been there, but that Jacob had excused as youthful enthusiasm or entrepreneurial spirit. Thomas met his gaze and had the grace to look away, shame momentarily breaking through his usual confidence. Catherine stood motionless, her bouquet of dried lavender crushed in her white-knuckled grip, her face a mask of humiliation and fury. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly through the room. "Mr. Thornton, is what this woman says true? Did you promise her marriage while simultaneously arranging for me to travel 2,000 miles to become your wife?" Thomas opened his mouth, and Jacob could see him weighing another lie, another smooth explanation that would minimize and deflect. But the assembled guests were all watching, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust to poorly concealed satisfaction at witnessing such spectacular disgrace. Walter Pritchard, a man whose word was his bond and who demanded the same from his neighbors, stood with his arms crossed and his face set in granite. The Mackenzies whispered among themselves in Gaelic, their disapproval evident in their tone, if not their words. Thomas swallowed hard, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its easy charm. "There may have been some misunderstanding. Miss Ruby and I did share some time together in Cheyenne, but I never intended." He trailed off as Catherine's expression hardened into something that looked like tempered steel. "Never intended to honor your promises to her, just as you had no real intention of honoring your promises to me." Catherine's voice remained level, but fury burned behind her words like fire beneath ice. "I see now that your letters were as fictional as a dime novel, painting a picture of partnership and respect, when what you truly wanted was a housekeeper you could bed without paying wages. She dropped the crushed bouquet and turned to face the assembled guests with her chin raised and her back straight. I apologize to all of you for this spectacle. I was deceived, as it appears many women have been deceived by Thomas Thornton's charm and empty promises. This wedding will not take place. She moved toward the stairs with measured dignity, and Jacob found himself stepping forward. Miss Morrison, please wait. Catherine paused on the third step, turning to look down at him with eyes that held exhausted sadness rather than the anger he had expected. There's nothing more to say, Mr. Thornton. I've been made a fool of, humiliated in front of strangers, and left in an impossible situation 2,000 miles from anything resembling home. I believe I've earned the right to some privacy. She continued up the stairs, her footsteps measured and controlled, despite what must have been a powerful urge to flee. The sound of her door closing echoed through the house like a gunshot. Jacob turned back to face the assembled guests and his brother, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, as it always had when Thomas's schemes collapsed. I apologize for this unfortunate situation. Perhaps it's best if everyone returns to their homes. Rosa will pack up the food for you to take. The guests departed with alacrity, eager to escape the awkwardness, and equally eager to spread the story of Thomas Thornton's disgrace across the territory. Ruby had collapsed into a chair, weeping now instead of raging, and Jacob sent Charlie to fetch Doc Harrison from Redemption Creek to examine her and determine if her claim of pregnancy was true. Thomas stood beside the cold fireplace, his fine suit suddenly looking cheap and tawdry, his face a study in resentment and embarrassment. When the last guest had departed, and only Rosa and the ranch hands remained to clean up the remnants of the aborted wedding, Thomas finally spoke. You're gonna lecture me now, I suppose? Tell me how I've ruined everything, how I've brought shame on the family name. Jacob moved close enough to see the red veins in his brother's eyes, the stubble on his jaw, the fear beneath the bravado. No lecture, Thomas. Just a question. What happened to you? Thomas laughed bitterly, pouring himself 3 fingers of whiskey from the bottle on the sideboard and downing it in a single swallow. What happened to me? I got tired, Jacob, tired of working my ass off on this ranch, while you got all the credit, all the respect. You're the war hero, the stoic frontiersman everyone admires. I'm just the charming younger brother who's good at selling cattle and closing deals. He poured another drink, his hand shaking slightly. I met Ruby in Cheyenne during last month's cattle auction. She was kind to me, laughed at my jokes, made me feel like I was worth something beyond my usefulness to the Thornton Ranch. So yes, I made promises I shouldn't have made. And yes, I wrote to that matrimonial agency thinking a proper wife would give me the respectability I couldn't seem to earn any other way. He met Jacob's gaze with defiant desperation. I wanted what you have: respect, purpose, a sense that I matter. Jacob felt anger warring with pity, and for the first time in 17 years, he allowed himself to speak the truth that had been festering beneath their partnership. What I have, Thomas, I earned through 17 years of 16-hour days, through winters that nearly killed me, through building something from nothing while you spent our profits on fine clothes and gambling debts. He kept his voice level, but each word fell like a hammer blow. You say you want respect, but respect isn't given. It's earned through consistency, through keeping your word, through putting in the work when no one's watching. You've never wanted to earn anything, Thomas. You've only wanted to harvest what others have planted. He gestured toward the stairs. That woman up there traveled 2,000 miles because you painted a picture of a partner, a helpmate, a future. And you couldn't even be bothered to meet her train because you were too busy breaking promises to another woman. Thomas's face flushed red, and he slammed his glass down on the sideboard with enough force to crack it. So it's all my fault? You bear no responsibility for anything? You who decided we build this ranch in the middle of nowhere, who insisted we put every penny back into the operation instead of enjoying any of the profits, who made me feel like a kept boy instead of an equal partner? The accusations spilled out like poison from a lanced wound, years of resentment finally finding voice. You never wanted a partner, Jacob. You wanted a pet. Someone to handle the parts of ranching you found distasteful while you played the noble frontiersman. He grabbed his hat from the table and moved toward the door. Well, I'm done. You can have your precious ranch, your lonely empire. I'm taking what money is mine and heading to California, where maybe I can find something resembling a life. Jacob watched his brother storm out, heard the sound of a horse being saddled in rough haste, and felt nothing but a strange hollow relief as Thomas rode away from the ranch they had built together. Rosa emerged from the kitchen, her face creased with concern. "Senor Jacob, the girl Ruby is sleeping now. Doc Harrison says she is maybe 6 weeks pregnant, maybe not pregnant at all. Sometimes women make themselves believe what they need to believe." She moved to begin collecting the scattered wedding decorations, her movements brisk and efficient. "And the señorita upstairs? What will happen to her now?" Jacob had no answer to that question. Catherine Morrison was trapped in an impossible situation. No husband, no home, stranded on a Wyoming cattle ranch with winter approaching, and no means of returning east until spring when the passes cleared. The code of frontier hospitality demanded he offer her refuge. But what that refuge might look like, how long it might last, he could not begin to imagine. He climbed the stairs and knocked softly on Catherine's door, unsure what he would say, but knowing silence was not an option. After a long moment, her voice called out, "Come in." She sat by the window, still wearing her wedding dress, watching the sun descend toward the mountains. Her face was dry of tears, composed into that mask of determination he had first seen on the train platform. "I'll leave as soon as it can be arranged," she said without preamble. "I won't impose on your hospitality any longer than absolutely necessary." Jacob entered the small room, feeling too large and awkward in this feminine space. "The passes will close within the month. No stage can get through once the heavy snows start. You'd be trapped in Redemption Creek all winter, assuming you could find lodging, which I doubt, given the town's limited accommodations." Catherine absorbed this information with visible effort at maintaining her composure. "Then I'll find employment there. I can cook, clean, keep accounts. Surely someone needs a housekeeper or a shopkeeper's assistant." Jacob shook his head slowly. "Redemption Creek has 3 saloons, Miss Morrison. The only employment for women there is the kind you don't want. The general store is run by Old Man Chen and his 3 sons. The hotel is owned by a widow who does all her own work. There's nowhere for you to go until spring." He pulled over a chair and sat, not too close, respecting her space, but needing her to hear him clearly. "You're welcome to stay here through the winter. We have the room, and Rosa could use help with the household work. Come spring, if you still want to leave, I'll personally escort you back to Cheyenne and ensure you have funds for passage back east." Catherine turned from the window, her green eyes searching his face for signs of deception or ulterior motive. "Why would you do this? Your brother humiliated me, humiliated your family. You have no obligation to me whatsoever." Jacob considered his answer carefully. aware that what he said now would set the tone for whatever relationship they would have through the long winter ahead. Because none of what happened today was your fault. You came here in good faith, expecting a partnership, and instead found lies and broken promises. That reflects on Thomas's character, not yours. He paused, then added with complete honesty, "And because this country is hard enough without good people being cast aside by those too selfish to honor their commitments, you deserve better than being abandoned in a frontier town with winter coming on." A single tear tracked down Catherine's cheek, the first emotion she had allowed herself since the wedding's collapse. She wiped it away quickly, but not before Jacob saw the exhaustion and fear beneath her dignified facade. "I don't know how to accept charity, Mr. Thornton. In Boston, I worked for everything I received, maintained my independence, even when it would have been easier to accept help." Jacob stood, moving toward the door to give her privacy. "Then don't think of it as charity. Think of it as employment, if that sits better with you. Rosa genuinely does need help, especially during winter when we're all confined closer together. You know horses. You could help with the breeding records. Maybe work with the young stock come spring. Frontier life doesn't allow for pride when survival is at stake, Miss Morrison. We all help each other here, or we all perish." He paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorframe. "Take tonight to rest. Tomorrow we can discuss practical arrangements. But know that you're welcome here for as long as you need refuge." That night, Jacob sat on the porch long after the last lights in the house had been extinguished, his Winchester rifle across his knees and his thoughts as dark as the moonless sky. Thomas had taken his personal horse and his saddle, but had left most of his possessions behind, including several $100s in gambling debts that Jacob would now have to settle to protect the family name. The wedding guests would spread the story of Thomas Thornton's disgrace across 3 counties by week's end, and Jacob would face the questions and the judgment that came with being the brother who remained. But more than his brother's betrayal or his own damaged reputation, Jacob found his thoughts returning to Catherine Morrison, asleep in the room above, her life disrupted and her dreams shattered by a selfish man's empty promises. He had seen that kind of quiet strength before in the war, in soldiers who kept marching even after everything inside them had broken. She would survive this, he thought. She would adapt and endure because she had no other choice. The next morning dawned with fresh snow dusting the peaks and a north wind that promised winter's imminent arrival. Jacob rose before dawn, as always, tending to the horses and checking on the cattle before returning to the house for breakfast. He found Catherine already in the kitchen, working alongside Rosa to prepare biscuits and bacon, her hair pinned back practically and her dress protected by one of Rosa's aprons. She looked up as he entered, her face showing the effects of a sleepless night, but her eyes clear and determined. "Rosa is teaching me to make proper biscuits," she announced, her tone deliberately light despite the weight of yesterday's disasters. "Apparently, my Boston training was insufficient for frontier cooking." Rosa laughed, patting Catherine's hand with motherly affection. "The señorita learns quick, Señor Jacob. She will make a fine ranch woman." Over breakfast, they established the practical arrangements for Catherine's presence at the ranch. She would help Rosa with household tasks, keep the ranch accounts and correspondence that Thomas had neglected, and work with Jacob on the horse breeding records he maintained in careful detail. In exchange, she would have room and board through the winter, and a small wage that would give her independence when spring arrived. It was a business-like arrangement that allowed both of them to maintain proper distance and decorum. though Jacob found himself acutely aware of Catherine's presence in ways that had nothing to do with household management. She moved through the ranch with quiet competence, learning the rhythms of frontier life with the same focused attention she had given to her examination of the horses. Within a week, she could identify each of the 6 ranch hands by sight, knew the names of a dozen horses, and had organized the chaotic ranch accounts into a ledger system that made Thomas's incompetence painfully obvious. November gave way to December, and the first serious snow arrived with the violence typical of Wyoming winters. The storm lasted 3 days, dropping 4 feet of snow and bringing temperatures that froze water in the horse troughs overnight. Jacob and the ranch hands worked in brutal conditions to bring the cattle down from the high pastures before they were trapped by drifts, racing against time and weather to save the herd that represented years of labor and investment. Catherine watched from the house as they departed each morning into the white chaos, her face tight with worry that she tried to hide behind household tasks. When they returned each evening, exhausted and half-frozen, she had hot food ready and warm water for washing, and she helped Rosa tend to frostbitten fingers and pulled muscles with the competent care of someone trained in nursing. On the 4th night, when the storm finally broke and stars emerged in crystalline clarity, Jacob found Catherine on the porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, staring out at the transformed landscape. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, joining her in the cold. "Deadly, but beautiful." Catherine nodded, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "I've never seen anything like it. In Boston, snow meant inconvenience and cold sidewalks. Here, it means the difference between life and death." She turned to look at him, and in the starlight, her face was pale and thoughtful. "How do you bear it, Mr. Thornton? The constant struggle, the knowledge that one mistake could mean disaster. Don't you ever want to go somewhere easier? Somewhere that doesn't demand everything you have just to survive?" Jacob considered the question, leaning against the porch railing and looking out at his ranch, his land, his purpose. "After the war, I was broken in ways I didn't know a man could break. I'd seen and done things that made me question whether I deserved to keep breathing. When Thomas suggested we come west, I thought maybe the land would finish what the war had started." He paused, remembering those early years of brutal labor and black despair. But the land demanded I be strong enough to meet it. It didn't care about my guilt or my ghosts. It only cared whether I could do the work. So I did the work, day after day, until one morning I woke up and realized I wanted to live again. He met her eyes. "This country breaks the weak and the unprepared, Miss Morrison. But for those strong enough to meet its demands, it offers something rare, the chance to rebuild yourself from the ground up." Catherine absorbed his words in silence, and Jacob wondered if he had revealed too much, exposed vulnerabilities he usually kept locked away. But when she spoke, her voice held understanding rather than pity. "Mrs. Hartwell, the woman I worked for, used to say I had an unfortunate tendency toward independence and strong opinions. She meant it as criticism, of course. In her world, women were meant to be decorative and compliant, skilled at making men comfortable and nothing more." She pulled the blanket tighter against the cold. "I came west thinking marriage to a rancher would give me purpose and partnership, a life where my strength and competence would be assets rather than flaws. Instead, I found—" She trailed off, but Jacob understood what she meant to say. She had found Thomas, a man who wanted a decorative addition to his life, not a partner. "I'm sorry my brother disappointed you," Your brother revealed himself clearly, Catherine said with a wry smile that held more sadness than humor. In some ways, I suppose I should thank him. Better to know the truth before binding myself legally to a man who would never see me as an equal. She turned to face him fully, and Jacob became aware of how close they stood on the narrow porch, how the cold had brought color to her cheeks and brightness to her eyes. You're not like him, are you? Thomas uses charm to get what he wants. You just do the work. It was observation rather than compliment, but Jacob felt warmth spread through his chest, despite the brutal cold. I learned young that charm fails when it matters most. Better to be reliable than charming. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, sharing the cold and the starlight, and an understanding that words would have diminished. Christmas arrived with little fanfare, marked by Rosa's traditional Mexican feast and small gifts exchanged among the household. Catherine had sewn new shirts for Jacob and the ranch hands, working by lamplight in the evenings, and Jacob had carved her a wooden box for keeping correspondence, its lid inlaid with bits of turquoise he had traded from a Shoshone craftsman years earlier. When she opened it on Christmas morning, her face lit with genuine pleasure, and Jacob felt a satisfaction he had not experienced in years. They spent the day in companionable ease, reading by the fire while snow fell steadily outside, occasionally venturing out to tend to the animals before retreating to the warmth. Walter Pritchard stopped by in the afternoon with a bottle of good whiskey and news from Redemption Creek. Thomas had been seen in Cheyenne, drinking heavily and losing at cards, his plans for California apparently delayed indefinitely by his own recklessness. January brought temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero, forcing all work to cease, except for the most essential care of livestock. The ranch hands spent their days in the bunkhouse, mending tack and playing cards, while Jacob, Catherine, and Rosa remained close to the fires in the main house. It was during these long, cold weeks that Jacob discovered Catherine's love of literature matched his own, and their evening conversations ranged from Shakespeare to Hawthorne to debates about Melville's symbolism in Moby Dick. She read aloud in the evenings, her voice bringing life to passages he had read a dozen times before, and he found himself looking forward to these hours with an intensity that both pleased and disturbed him. She was still his brother's intended, even if that intention had been shattered. To feel attraction toward her seemed a betrayal of some fundamental code, even though Thomas had forfeited any claim through his own actions. One evening in late January, as Catherine read from Wuthering Heights, Jacob found himself studying her face in the firelight, noting the delicate line of her jaw, the way her eyes moved across the page, the unconscious grace of her hands as she turned pages. She looked up suddenly, catching his gaze, and for a charged moment, neither of them moved. "Mr. Thornton," she said softly, closing the book, "I wonder if we might discuss an uncomfortable matter." Jacob's chest tightened, wondering if she had perceived his growing attraction and meant to address it directly. "Of course, Miss Morrison." Catherine set the book aside and folded her hands in her lap, the gesture one of determination rather than nervousness. "Rosa tells me that Thomas has returned to the ranch several times in my absence, taking money from the safe and items he claims are his personal property." Jacob felt anger kindle at this news, though he kept his voice level. "Rosa shouldn't have troubled you with this. Thomas has certain rights as a partner in the ranch, even if he's choosing not to exercise his responsibilities." Catherine shook her head firmly. "From what I've learned of your partnership, Mr. Thornton, you've done 90% of the work, while Thomas has claimed 50% of the profits. I've reviewed the accounts thoroughly now, and the pattern is clear. You build, he spends. You invest in the ranch's future, he invests in his own pleasure. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. I've managed households and estates for difficult people, and I recognize exploitation when I see it. Your brother is using you. Has been for years, and you allow it out of misplaced loyalty. The words stung because they were true. Because Catherine had identified in weeks what Jacob had been avoiding acknowledging for years. He's my brother, Jacob said, the response automatic and inadequate. Family doesn't abandon family, Miss Morrison. After the war, when I came back broken, Thomas convinced me to live again, to come west and build something new. I owe him for that. Catherine's expression softened with understanding, but her voice remained firm. You owe him nothing more than you've already given. 17 years of partnership should count for something, but only if both partners are truly invested in the enterprise. From what I can see, Thomas is invested only in himself. She paused. The suggestion was both shocking and liberating, and Jacob realized that some part of him had been hoping for exactly this permission to sever ties that had become more burden than blessing. That would require significant capital. The ranch is profitable, but most of our assets are in land and livestock. Catherine nodded, clearly having anticipated this objection. I have the inheritance Mrs. Hartwell left me, $3,500, currently sitting in a Boston bank account. It's not enough to buy Thomas out entirely, but it could be a significant down payment, with the rest paid from ranch profits over the next several years. She met his eyes directly. I would become a silent partner, taking a small percentage of profits in return for the capital investment. It would give me stake in something real, Mr. Thornton, and free you from a partnership that's outlived its usefulness. Jacob stared at her, stunned by the offer and the implications behind it. Miss Morrison, I couldn't possibly accept such a proposal. You've already suffered enough financial loss through Thomas's deception. But Catherine shook her head firmly. This wouldn't be charity or compensation, Mr. Thornton. This would be a sound business investment in a profitable enterprise, with legal documentation and fair terms. I've learned enough about ranching to know the Thornton operation is well managed and could thrive even more without Thomas draining resources. She smiled slightly. Besides, I find I like it here. I like the work, the challenge, the sense of building something lasting. If I'm to remain through the winter regardless, why not invest in the enterprise I'm helping to maintain? The logic was sound, the opportunity clear, but Jacob hesitated, knowing that such an arrangement would bind Catherine to the ranch, to him, in ways that felt dangerous given his growing feelings. February brought a brief thaw, followed by more snow, trapping them all in a cycle of hard labor and harder recovery. Catherine had fully integrated into the ranch's operations, working alongside Rosa and the hands with a competence that earned their respect. Charlie Deerfoot, a half-Shoshone cowboy who had worked for the Thorntons for 8 years, told Jacob one morning that the lady has good ranch sense, like she was born to this life instead of that soft eastern world. Young Pete Henderson, just 19 and still learning the ranching trade, had developed an obvious infatuation with Catherine that she handled with gentle firmness, neither encouraging nor humiliating the boy's admiration. And Rosa had taken to calling Catherine Mija, the casual endearment speaking to the motherly affection the older woman felt for this transplanted Easterner who had adapted so readily to frontier hardships. In mid-February, Thomas appeared at the ranch unannounced, riding a horse that showed signs of hard use and wearing clothes that had seen better days. He looked older than his 37 years, his face haggard, and his eyes holding a desperate quality that made Jacob's heart sink despite his anger. They met in the barn, away from the house where Catherine might overhear, and Thomas got straight to the point. "I need money, Jacob. $2,000 to cover debts in Cheyenne before I can head to California." Jacob felt the familiar weight of his brother's problems settle on his shoulders. But for the first time in 17 years, he refused to pick up that burden. "No, Thomas. I've covered your gambling debts, your drinking, your women, for too long. The well is dry." Thomas's face flushed red with anger and shame. "You're my brother. You owe me this much, at least." Jacob shook his head slowly, feeling sadness rather than anger as he finally spoke the truth that had been building for months. "I owe you nothing more than I've already given, Thomas. 17 years of partnership where I did the work and you spent the profits. Respect from neighbors I had to rebuild after your disgrace with Miss Morrison. The ranch's reputation I've had to defend while you run from your responsibilities." He paused, letting the words settle between them like stones. "Miss Morrison has offered to buy out your share of the ranch, $3,500 as an initial payment, with the balance paid from profits over the next 3 years. It's a fair offer, probably more generous than you deserve." Thomas's expression cycled through shock, anger, and finally calculation as he weighed his options and found them limited. "The Eastern woman who was supposed to be my wife is now buying my share of the ranch I helped build?" "You helped build nothing, Thomas. You made business contacts and handled sales while I did everything else, and you forfeited any claim to Miss Morrison when you humiliated her in front of half the county." Jacob's voice remained level, but finality rang in every word. "You can accept this offer and have capital to start fresh in California, or you can refuse and continue your current trajectory toward complete ruin. But either way, you're no longer a partner in the Thornton Ranch. I'll buy you out with Miss Morrison's help or with a bank loan, but this partnership is over." For a long moment, Thomas stared at him, and Jacob saw his brother truly for perhaps the first time. Not the charming younger sibling he had protected and excused for years, but a weak man who had never learned to stand on his own, who blamed others for failures of his own making. "You've always thought you were better than me," Thomas said finally, his voice bitter but defeated. The war hero, the stoic frontiersman, the one everyone respects. Well, you're welcome to it all. The back-breaking work, the isolation, the woman who was supposed to be mine but clearly prefers you. Jacob felt those last words like a blow, confirming what he had hoped Catherine kept carefully hidden, that the attraction he felt was not entirely one-sided. But he simply nodded, refusing to be drawn into old arguments and recriminations. "Take the offer, Thomas. Take the money and build something new somewhere that suits you better. California might be exactly what you need. New opportunities, no history, a chance to become who you want to be instead of living in anyone's shadow." It was the kindest thing he could offer, and they both knew it was also goodbye. Thomas left the next morning with a signed contract selling his share of the ranch to Jacob and Catherine Morrison, equal partners in an enterprise that would bear only the Thornton name. He took his personal belongings, his horse, and a bank draft for $3,500, and he rode toward Cheyenne without looking back at the ranch he was abandoning. Jacob watched from the porch as his brother disappeared down the wagon trail. Feeling relief and sadness in equal measure, Rosa emerged from the house, pressing a warm cup of coffee into his cold hands. You did the right thing, Señor Jacob. Sometimes love means letting people go, even when it hurts. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Catherine appeared beside him, her presence solid and comforting. I'm sorry if this causes you pain, Mr. Thornton. I know he's your brother, regardless of his failings. Jacob shook his head, turning to look at her properly. This woman who had come west seeking partnership and had instead become his partner in an entirely different arrangement. You gave him a future, Miss Morrison. More than he deserved. Certainly, more than I would have offered if you hadn't suggested it. And you've given me freedom from a burden I didn't realize I was carrying. He paused, aware that they stood at a threshold that went beyond business partnerships and winter hospitality. We should probably discuss what this partnership actually means, practically speaking. You're now half owner of a working cattle ranch in Wyoming Territory. That's not a small responsibility. Catherine met his gaze steadily. I understand that, Mr. Thornton. I've spent the winter learning this ranch, this land, this life. I'm not a naive Eastern woman anymore, if I ever was. I know what I'm committing to. March brought the first signs of spring, with the snow beginning to retreat from the south-facing slopes and the creek rising with snowmelt from the high country. Catherine worked alongside Jacob now as a true partner, learning to read the cattle's condition after the hard winter, helping plan the spring branding and roundup, discussing breeding decisions for the horse herd. They fell into an easy partnership that was everything her arrangement with Thomas had promised to be, but never could have been. Mutual respect, shared labor, honest communication. But beneath the partnership ran a current of awareness that grew stronger with each passing day, each shared sunrise, each evening conversation that stretched long past when they should have retired to their separate rooms. Jacob found himself acutely conscious of Catherine's presence in ways both thrilling and terrifying, knowing that to act on his attraction would change everything between them. In early April, during a rare moment when they were alone in the barn, tending to a mare with a difficult foaling, Catherine broke the careful silence they had been maintaining around their unspoken feelings. Mr. Thornton, Jacob, we need to discuss the situation between us. She kept her attention on the laboring mare, her hands gentle but firm as she helped guide the foal into the world. We've been dancing around it for weeks now, this attraction that's grown between us. It complicates our partnership, makes everything more difficult. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he realized she was giving voice to what he had been too afraid to acknowledge. I know, I've tried to suppress it, to maintain proper distance. You were meant for my brother, and even though he forfeited any claim, it feels wrong somehow. Like I'm betraying a trust, even though Thomas broke that trust long before I did. Catherine looked up at him then, her hands still working to assist the mare, but her eyes fierce and determined. Thomas had no claim on me, beyond his lies and empty promises. What I feel for you has nothing to do with him, and everything to do with who you are, a man of integrity, competence, and genuine partnership. The foal emerged in a rush of fluid, and Catherine immediately began clearing its nostrils, while the exhausted mare turned to investigate her new offspring. I'm not asking for marriage, Jacob. God knows I've had enough of that institution's disappointments. But I am saying that we could have something real here, something built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than romantic illusions. She met his gaze directly. If you want it, if you're brave enough to risk our partnership for the possibility of something more. Jacob moved to help her with the newborn foal, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. In his world, in this time and place, relationships between men and women followed strict patterns: courtship, marriage, family. What Catherine seemed to be suggesting existed outside those patterns, a frontier arrangement that matched the unconventional nature of their partnership. What exactly are you proposing, Catherine? The use of her first name felt intimate and right, a small breach of the formal barrier they had maintained. Catherine smiled, tired and covered in the mess of foaling, but more beautiful to Jacob than any pampered society woman could ever be. I'm proposing we acknowledge what's between us honestly. We're partners in this ranch, equal stakeholders in its future. Perhaps we could be partners in other ways as well, building something together that doesn't fit conventional patterns, but suits us perfectly. Before Jacob could respond, the barn door burst open and Charlie Deerfoot rushed in, his face tight with alarm. "Boss, we got trouble. Riders coming hard from the south, maybe 10 of them. They're flying no colors, which means either outlaws or trouble looking for a place to happen." Jacob's mind shifted instantly from personal matters to ranch security, his war-trained instincts taking over. Get Pete and the others armed and positioned at the house. "Catherine, you and Rosa stay inside with the rifles loaded." He grabbed his Winchester from its place by the barn door and checked the loads in his Colt revolver. "Charlie, did you recognize any of them?" Charlie shook his head grimly. "Too far out still, but they're riding like men with purpose, and that purpose usually means trouble for someone." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Let's greet our visitors and see what they want. But keep the hands ready in case talking doesn't solve whatever problem they're bringing." The riders emerged from the cottonwoods along Thornton Creek 15 minutes later, and Jacob's stomach sank as he recognized the leader. Samuel Kearns, a rancher from south of Redemption Creek, with a reputation for ruthlessness and a long-standing resentment toward the Thorntons for controlling the best water rights in the valley. Kearns was a big man who had made his fortune through questionable land deals and intimidation, and he was flanked by 9 men who looked more like gunfighters than ranch hands. They reined in their horses 20 yards from where Jacob stood on the porch, his Winchester held casually but ready. "Thornton," Kearns said without preamble, his voice carrying across the yard. "Heard your brother finally showed some sense and left this place. Also heard you took on a new partner, some Eastern woman who doesn't know cattle from chickens. Thought I'd come by and make you a fair offer for the whole spread before you run it into the ground." Jacob kept his expression neutral despite the insult, aware of Catherine watching from the window, and his ranch hands positioned strategically around the yard. "The Thornton Ranch isn't for sale, Kearns. Not today, not ever. You've wasted your time and your men's time riding out here." Kearns's smile was cold and calculated. "Everything's for sale, Thornton. It's just a matter of price. I'm offering you $50,000 for the land, the cattle, the buildings." That's generous, considering half the ranch is now owned by some mail-order bride your brother discarded. Jacob felt rage kindle at the casual cruelty of the words, but he kept his voice level. "Miss Morrison is my business partner, not that it's any of your concern, and I said no. Now you and your men can turn around and ride back to your own spread before this conversation becomes less friendly." Kearns' expression hardened, and several of his men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to holstered weapons. "I'm not used to being refused, Thornton. In fact, I'm not sure I can accept refusal in this particular matter. See, I've already made plans that depend on controlling your water rights, and those plans don't accommodate your stubbornness." It was a direct threat, barely veiled, and Jacob heard Charlie and Pete shift positions behind him, ready to back whatever play he made. "Then you made plans based on false assumptions, Kearns. This ranch has been in my family for 17 years. We've fought Indians, outlaws, winters that killed weaker men, and we're still here. You think 10 hired guns are going to intimidate us into selling?" He raised his voice slightly so all of Kern's men could hear. "Any man who starts shooting on this property today should understand he's committing murder, not enforcing some legal claim. And Wyoming justice is quick for killers." For a tense moment, the situation balanced on a knife's edge, and Jacob prepared himself for violence. But then Kearns laughed, a harsh sound without humor, and raised his hand to stop his men from drawing. "You're right, Thornton. Today isn't the day for this particular resolution, but I'm a patient man, and opportunities have a way of presenting themselves to those who wait." He gathered his reins, preparing to wheel his horse. "You might want to be careful, though. Accidents happen on frontier ranches. Fires, stampedes, men getting hurt in the normal course of work. Be a shame if your new partner got hurt because you were too stubborn to recognize a good offer." He rode off with his men before Jacob could respond, but the threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Charlie moved to stand beside Jacob, his rifle still ready. "Boss, that man means real trouble. Kearns doesn't make threats he don't intend to follow through on." Jacob nodded grimly, watching the riders disappear back toward the tree line. "I know. We'll need to post guards at night, keep the stock closer to the ranch buildings, maybe even hire a couple more hands who can shoot as well as they can rope cattle." He turned as Catherine emerged from the house, her face pale but determined. "That was about water rights, wasn't it? I've studied the maps and deeds. Our access to year-round creek water makes this ranch valuable, especially in a dry year." Jacob was impressed again by how quickly Catherine had grasped the essentials of ranching. "That's exactly right. Kearns has been trying to control all the water in this valley for years. With our ranch, he'd have effective monopoly and could dictate terms to every homesteader and small rancher in 3 counties. He met her eyes squarely. "This is part of frontier life I didn't fully prepare you for. Ownership disputes here don't always get settled in courtrooms." Catherine lifted her chin in that gesture of determination he had come to recognize and admire. "Then we'll need to be prepared to defend what's ours. I told you I came west seeking partnership and purpose, Jacob. I meant it. If defending this ranch is part of that partnership, I'm ready." Over the next several weeks, they fortified the ranch against potential attack, hiring 2 additional hands who came with solid reputations and the ability to handle weapons as well as livestock. Jake Morrison, no relation to Catherine despite sharing a surname, had served as a cavalry scout during the Indian Wars and brought tactical knowledge that complemented Jacob's own military experience. Ben Hawkins was a former marshal from Kansas who had retired to ranch work but retained the alertness and combat instincts of a lawman. Together, they implemented guard rotations, identified defensive positions, and drilled the entire crew on responding to various threats. Through April and into May, the threatened attack didn't materialize, but tension lay over the ranch like humidity before a thunderstorm. They proceeded with spring roundup and branding as usual, but always with armed men posted as lookouts, always with weapons close at hand. Catherine worked alongside the men during roundup, learning to manage cattle with increasing skill and earning respect through her willingness to do hard, dirty work without complaint. Jacob found himself watching her rope and brand calves, her movements growing more confident each day, and he felt pride mixed with concern. She had committed herself fully to this life, to this ranch, to him, and he knew now that his own feelings had evolved far beyond simple attraction into something deeper and more lasting. When she rode in at the end of a long day, covered in dust and sweat and smiling with the satisfaction of work well done. He saw not a displaced Eastern woman, but a true partner in every sense of the word. In mid-May, word reached them through Walter Pritchard that Kearns had been making moves to purchase smaller homesteads adjacent to Thornton property, systematically surrounding them and gaining leverage through control of neighboring land. It was a slower strategy than direct confrontation, but potentially more effective, gradually squeezing the Thorntons until selling became their only viable option. Jacob and Catherine spent an evening reviewing their options, spreading maps and property deeds across the dining table while Rosa kept coffee coming. "He's playing a long game," Catherine observed, tracing Kearns's apparent strategy with her finger. "Buying up these properties gives him influence with territorial authorities, makes him look like a growing power in the region, while painting us as stubborn obstacles to development." Jacob nodded, impressed again by her strategic thinking. Standard business tactics applied to frontier property disputes. In 10 years, this whole territory might be states with real law and courts. Kearns is positioning himself for that future. Catherine tapped the map thoughtfully. "Then we need to beat him at his own game. These homesteaders he's buying out, they're selling because they're struggling, right? Because frontier life proved harder than they expected?" Jacob confirmed this with a nod. "Most of them came west with romantic notions and insufficient capital. One bad winter or one failed harvest and they're ready to give up." Catherine's eyes lit with the intensity he had learned meant she had an idea. "What if we offered them an alternative to selling? Some kind of cooperative arrangement where they maintain ownership but gain the support of our larger operation. Shared resources, shared labor during peak times, better access to markets through our established connections." It was an innovative approach, one that went against the typical frontier ethic of fierce independence. But Jacob could see the potential. "That's complicated. Would require legal agreements, coordination, trust?" Catherine smiled. "Everything worthwhile is complicated. But we could build something here beyond just defending our own property. We could create a network of ranchers and homesteaders who support each other, who present a unified front against men like Kearns who operate through intimidation and isolated targeting." She leaned forward, her enthusiasm kindling his own. "You have respect in this valley, Jacob. People trust the Thornton name even after Thomas's disgrace, because they trust you. If you proposed this kind of cooperative arrangement, they'd listen." Over the next month, Jacob and Catherine rode to neighboring homesteads, presenting their proposal to struggling families who faced the choice between selling to Kearns or abandoning their claims entirely. The reception was mixed. Some saw it as charity and refused from pride. Others worried about legal complications. But enough accepted that by mid-June they had formed a loose alliance of 6 small ranches and homesteads that agreed to coordinate on markets, share equipment and labor, and present unified opposition to Kearns's expansion. It was during this period of intense activity and planning that Jacob and Catherine's relationship deepened beyond partnership into something that defied simple categorization. They worked together seamlessly, complementing each other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses. Jacob provided frontier experience and physical capability, while Catherine contributed strategic thinking and organizational skills. But more than that, they shared a vision for what the ranch and the broader community could become, a future built on cooperation rather than competition, on sustainable growth rather than exploitation. Late-night planning sessions often ended with conversations that ranged from practical ranch management to philosophy, literature, dreams for the future. They laughed together, argued occasionally, and developed a shorthand communication that needed few words. And slowly, carefully, they allowed physical affection to creep into their relationship. A hand briefly clasped, shoulders touching as they reviewed documents, an embrace after a particularly difficult day that lasted longer than strictly proper. On a warm June evening, after a successful meeting with the cooperative homesteaders, Jacob and Catherine rode back to the ranch together, their horses moving at an easy walk through the twilight. The mountains were purple silhouettes against a sky painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air smelled of pine and new grass. They had stopped to water the horses at a creek when Catherine turned to Jacob with an expression he had learned to recognize as prelude to serious conversation. "Jacob, I need to tell you something." Her voice was steady, but held an undercurrent of nervousness. "I've fallen in love with you. Not partnership love or affectionate regard, but actual, terrifying, complicated love." Jacob felt his breath catch, all the feelings he had been carefully managing, suddenly surging to the surface. "Catherine, She held up her hand to stop him. "Let me finish. I know this is complicated. I came here to marry your brother, and now I'm in love with you. Society would call that inappropriate at best, scandalous at worst. But I don't care about society's opinion anymore. I care about honesty, about building something real with someone who sees me as an equal. So I'm telling you plainly, I love you, Jacob Thornton. And I believe you love me too, even if you're too honorable to say it." Jacob dismounted and moved to stand before her, reaching up to help her down from her horse. When her feet touched the ground, he kept his hands on her waist, looking into those green eyes that had captured him from the first moment on the train platform. "You're right. I do love you. I've been fighting it for months, telling myself it was wrong because you were meant for Thomas, because mixing business and personal feelings is dangerous, because 1,000 other reasons that suddenly seem meaningless." He pulled her closer, feeling her heart beating against his chest. "I love your strength, your intelligence, your refusal to be diminished by circumstances or other people's expectations. I love how you've adapted to this life without losing yourself, how you challenge me to be better, how you see possibilities I would never have imagined." He paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "But I'm 47 years old, Catherine, with war ghosts and frontier calluses. I'm not the romantic figure from a novel." Catherine laughed softly, reaching up to touch his weathered face with gentle fingers. "I don't want a romantic figure from a novel. I want a real man who builds real things and meets life honestly. I want you, Jacob Thornton, exactly as you are." He kissed her then, a kiss that held months of suppressed longing and the promise of futures they could build together. The sun set behind the mountains while they stood by the creek, two people who had found in each other what they had been seeking without knowing: partnership, purpose, love that didn't diminish but enhanced their individual strengths. When they finally returned to the ranch, riding side by side in the gathering darkness, they did so as more than business partners, more than friends. They rode as two people who had chosen each other freely, without illusions or false promises, building on a foundation of shared work and mutual respect. The confrontation with Kearns came in late July, during the height of summer, when the grass was rich and the cattle were fattening on high pastures. He arrived at dawn with 20 men, believing he could catch the Thornton Ranch unprepared. But Jake Morrison had spotted them an hour earlier. And when Kearns rode into the ranch yard, he found Jacob and Catherine standing together on the porch, flanked by their ranch hands and 6 neighboring homesteaders who had ridden through the night to answer Jacob's call. The cooperative they had formed now showed its strength, presenting a unified front of armed, determined men and women who would not be intimidated. Kearns surveyed the assembled group, his expression shifting from confidence to calculation, as he recognized that the odds had changed fundamentally since his last visit. "Seems you've made some friends, Thornton," Kearns said, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. Jacob stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his holstered Colt. "I've made partners, Kearns, people who understand that cooperation builds more than intimidation ever could. Your offer is still refused, and it will remain refused no matter how many guns you bring to my door." He gestured to the assembled homesteaders. "Every person here has filed legal claims, paid their fees, and worked their land according to territorial law. You want a war over water rights? You'll get one. But it won't be the easy victory you imagined." For a long moment, Kearns stared at Jacob, clearly weighing his options. Then, surprisingly, he laughed and shook his head. "You're a stubborn man, Thornton. I respect that, even if it's inconvenient for my plans. Maybe we can work something out that doesn't involve bloodshed." The negotiation that followed took 3 hours, mediated by Walter Pritchard, who rode over when he heard about the standoff. In the end, Kearns agreed to abandon his aggressive expansion in exchange for negotiated water-sharing agreements that gave him access during dry seasons, while preserving the rights of existing ranchers and homesteaders. It wasn't the total victory he had wanted, but it was enough to satisfy his business needs without requiring violence. The cooperative held, stronger now for having faced down a real threat together. As Kearns rode away with his men, Jacob felt Catherine's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his own. They had defended more than just a ranch. They had defended a vision of how frontier life could be lived, cooperatively, sustainably, with justice instead of might making right. In September, as golden aspens marked the coming of autumn, Jacob and Catherine were married by Reverend Blackwood in a simple ceremony on the ranch, surrounded by Rosa, the ranch hands, and the homesteading families who had become their extended community. Catherine wore a practical dress of blue calico rather than silk, and Jacob wore his best shirt and denims rather than a suit. It was a frontier wedding that matched their frontier love, honest, practical, built on shared work rather than romantic illusions. When Reverend Blackwood pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled witnesses cheered, and Rosa wept with joy for the couple who had found each other through circumstances that would have broken weaker souls. That night, they stood together on the porch of their ranch house, no longer his ranch, but theirs, watching stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. The years that followed brought the challenges and rewards that frontier life always offered. They expanded the cooperative, adding more families and developing markets that gave small ranchers leverage against larger operations. Catherine proved as skilled at business negotiations as she was at ranch management, traveling to Denver and Cheyenne to establish contracts that benefited the entire cooperative. They raised 2 children, a daughter named Sarah, who inherited her mother's strategic mind, and a son named Daniel, who showed his father's affinity for horses and land. The Thornton Ranch prospered, not through exploitation or intimidation, but through hard work, innovation, and the partnerships they had built with neighboring families. Jacob never forgot that Catherine had come west as a mail-order bride for his brother, but he thanked whatever destiny had delivered her to him instead, giving him not just a wife, but a true partner in every sense of the word. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jacob and Catherine rode up to the ridge overlooking their valley, the same place he had brought her that first day when she arrived to marry Thomas. The ranch had grown, with new buildings and expanded pastures, and the cooperative had developed into a prosperous network of family operations that supported each other through droughts and hard winters. Catherine's hair showed threads of silver now, and Jacob's beard had gone completely gray. But the partnership between them remained as strong as the day they had first acknowledged their love beside the creek. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked, his arm around her shoulders, as they watched the sun set over land they had built together. Coming west, all the hardship and struggle, Catherine leaned into him, her smile holding 20 years of shared memories, challenges overcome, love deepened through testing. "Not for a single moment," she replied, turning to kiss him with the same passion that had ignited beside the creek 2 decades earlier. "I came west seeking purpose and partnership, and I found both beyond anything I could have imagined. Yes, it's been hard. Yes, there have been winters that tested us, and droughts that challenged us, and 1,000 difficulties I never anticipated in my Boston life. But we built something real here, Jacob. We built a life based on honesty and mutual respect, a partnership that makes both of us stronger. That's worth every hardship, every challenge, every moment of uncertainty." Below them, lights began appearing in ranch buildings and homesteads across the valley, each one representing a family they had helped, a partnership they had forged, a community they had built together through cooperation rather than competition. Jacob pulled her closer, grateful beyond words for the twist of fate that had brought her to him instead of to Thomas. His brother had long ago disappeared into California, chasing schemes that never quite materialized, sending occasional letters that spoke of plans and dreams, but never of accomplishments. Jacob didn't judge him harshly anymore. Thomas had simply been a man unsuited to the demands of frontier life, seeking shortcuts that didn't exist and charm that couldn't substitute for character. But that unsuitability had freed Catherine to find her true partner and had freed Jacob from a partnership that had been weighing him down for years. Sometimes, he reflected, life's greatest gifts came wrapped in disappointment. The mail-order bride meant for his brother had instead become the love of his life, his equal partner, the person who had helped him build not just a prosperous ranch, but a legacy of cooperation and community that would outlast them both. As full darkness settled over the valley and stars emerged in their millions, Jacob and Catherine rode back down to the ranch house, where Rosa would have dinner waiting, and where their children would be arguing cheerfully about some trivial matter. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, built through 20 years of hard work, honest partnership, and love that had grown stronger through testing. The frontier had given them both exactly what they had been seeking, though neither had known it when Catherine stepped off that train in Redemption Creek. A chance to build something real with someone who saw them clearly and loved them anyway. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, witnesses to all the human dramas played out in their shadow. Before them, the ranch lights beckoned them home, to the life they had built together, a life worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of uncertainty that had brought them to this place of contentment and partnership. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.